Okay, so I'm back. I tried to do this video earlier, but when I listened to it later, I realized that the ambient noise was a little bit annoying. So I'm changing it. But yes, I'm continuing to cover utilitarianism and how it is that we're understanding that by way of John Stuart Mill. Okay, so answering the question, what is utilitarianism? Then looking at how utilitarianism is consequentialist, then how is utilitarianism empirical, and likewise, how is utilitarianism tied to a problem from an environmental advantage. When we look it up, we find that utilitarianism is defined as a normative theory that we ought to concern ourselves with the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, and then in parentheses, associated with Bentham and Mill. Okay? So, first of all, Bentham and Mill are the originators of utilitarianism, and Bentham is late 18th century, early 19th century, and then likewise Bentham is mid 19th century, okay, thinker. And so both thinkers are also of the empiricist tradition, very similarly to Hume. Okay, so we want to see some similarities to Hume. So maybe we could just jump to this question: how is utilitarianism empirical? First of all, when we look at all three thinkers, we see that Hume, Bentham, and Mill are empiricists. And so what's important there is that when we're thinking of empirical philosophy, we're looking at the way that we have knowledge of the world by way of the senses, okay? And so sensory perception is a big deal there, but likewise, it's something that's shared between all three thinkers, okay? And it's also it then becomes a way in which we could understand morality, okay? So the distinction that we need to then make with Hume, Bentham, and Mill is that first, yes, they are empiricists, but the distinction then would be that Hume is more having to do with emotive way of thinking about ethics, whereas whereas Bentham and Mill are more in line with how it is that we're thinking of ethics in terms of a consequential theory. Okay, so their consequentialism then resides in the objectivity of a quantity of people. Okay, so in other words, getting back to a definition of utilitarianism, we see that it's a normative theory. In other words, it's a way for us to account for what we ought to do, how we ought to act. And so a way that we ought to act for a utilitarian is to concern ourselves with the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And the way that we are concerning ourselves is by placing value on the consequences of our action. And so when we place value on the consequences for our action, that is consequentialist, and it is likewise a utilitarian approach, okay? And so what that means is that that's the way in which we could base our understanding of the value empirically. In other words, what were the consequences of an action, and then likewise, did the consequences bring about the happiness for the most amount of people? That's the way in which we want to think of it as consequential. So in other words, we don't always know when we set out to act whether or not the consequences are going to end up bringing us, whether the consequences are going to bring about the most happiness for the most amount of people, okay? And so that's a way of understanding the importance of consequentialism, and then likewise how it's tied to empiricism, because the way that that's working with empiricism is that that's the way that we have the perceptual value. In other words, when we're understanding whether or not something is good for a number of people, we might take a survey, and that survey is going to give us a number or a quantity, but that quantity is then measuring the happiness for the most amount of people, okay? And so where the ethics lie is in whether or not the quantity is then revealing the happiness in the most amount of people consequentially, okay? So the distinction there is that the morality lies in the consequences, and so that's why it's really easy for us to start getting data and ethics confused, because we often think that the data reveals the ethics, but in actuality, the data is showing us the happiness of the people that is brought about by the consequence of our action, okay? So that's an important way to think about it consequentially, and then likewise how to tie in what is empirical, okay? So the distinction though with Hume is he was not thinking of quantities of people, he was just basing the importance of our ethical lives in terms of emotion, okay? So Bentham and Mill are then adding this quantification way of understanding to an empirical morality, okay? And so what's key there, we're dealing with wind, so I'm hoping that's not getting too windy. I apologize if it is. So then what's key there is thinking about how it is tied to environmentalism, okay? So when we're thinking about environmentalism, we could then think of something like the idea that I start out as a consumer wanting to recycle, and so my intent is to have a good consequence, so my action is starting to have a good consequence. But the question is, does my recycling actually bring about the consequence of happiness for the most amount of people? Okay, so that's something to consider, and a point of question, right? So a point of inquiry would be, when I recycle, does everything I recycle end up bringing about the happiness for the most amount of people, or is it something where it's not really clear what is happening there? Okay, so in other words, from an environmental perspective, we might start out with the idea that we're doing something good, but the question is, do we know what the consequences of that action are enough to qualify that as utilitarian, having utilitarian value, okay? And so one thing that's important there, if we're thinking about value, is thinking also then about the idea of happiness. So in other words, oftentimes you present the idea that utilitarianism is working toward bringing about the happiness / pleasure for the most amount of people. Well, the problem with that is that oftentimes we think, well, happiness there is too subjective, right? But what's key to remember is that we are looking at it in terms of quantities. So in other words, it's not just the subjective value of happiness, no. It's also tied in for utilitarianism in terms of quantities of people, okay? And so what's key about quantities of people is also key to utilitarianism as problematic. So if we think of quantities of people, we see that the number of people by which you're making happy is a good thing. In other words, that's how the consequences of that are how it is that you determine whether or not your utilitarianism is aiming toward the good, right? Is giving you something that's good news. Well, likewise, how is that then problematic in terms of your quantity. So, in other words, you might have a hierarchy of value. In other words, value of happiness is something where you're aiming for higher quality value, but the quantity still is something that is an issue. So in other words, quantities of happiness still are favoring the most amount of people who are rendered happy, who are made happy by the consequences. And so the question is, what happens to the minority? So in other words, the problem and critique of utilitarianism is that it cuts out that minority to the degree that it's not always, if you're only accounting for the majority's happiness, you're not necessarily accounting for the pain that you're causing the minority, okay? So that's a key point to consider as far as a critique of utilitarianism. All right, so we'll stop it here and talk to you later. Bye-bye.